Whoopi Goldberg loses control against Karoline Leavitt. It was supposed to be just another episode of The View, another heated debate between conservative and liberal voices, another day where Whoopi Goldberg, one of the show's most dominant and unchallenged figures, controlled the conversation with her usual confidence and authority. But what unfolded during that broadcast was something far more significant. What happened on live television that day was a moment that few anticipated. A moment where Whoopi, for the first time in years, lost control of the debate and the studio. Her opponent? Karoline Leavitt, the youngest woman to ever serve as White House press secretary, a rising conservative star known for her sharp intellect and refusal to back down. At just 27, she had already established herself as a formidable communicator, unfazed by media bias or political attacks. When she walked onto the set that morning, she knew exactly what kind of battlefield she was stepping into. The View had long been a stronghold for progressive voices, a place where conservative guests were often interrupted, challenged, and ridiculed. But today, something was different. From the moment Leavitt took her seat across from Goldberg, Joy Behar, and the rest of the co-hosts, the air in the studio felt charged. Longtime viewers of the show assumed they knew how this would go. Whoopi would dominate the exchange, delivering her signature sarcasm and dismissive retorts, and the conservative guest would either be flustered into submission or be cut off before they could fully articulate their points. But this time, the script didn't go as planned. The conversation began with the usual pleasantries, questions about Leavitt's career, her time in the White House, and her views on the current administration. The tension in the room was already apparent, with subtle smirks exchanged among the hosts, the kind of looks that suggested they were preparing to dismantle their guests' arguments with ease. Then the topic shifted to wokeness. Goldberg, leaning forward with a knowing smile, wasted no time in delivering her first jab. You say you're against wokeness, but do you even realize that without it, you wouldn't be sitting here today? You were probably picked for your role because you're a young, attractive woman. If it weren't for the very policies you criticize, you wouldn't even have a platform. A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Some of the panelists nodded in agreement. It was a classic View maneuver. Frame the conservative guest as a hypocrite. Paint them into a corner before they even have a chance to respond. But Leavitt didn't react the way they expected. She didn't flinch. She didn't stammer. She didn't even break eye contact. Instead, she let a small, composed smile form on her lips. A smile that said she saw exactly what Goldberg was trying to do. She gave a slow, deliberate nod, not in agreement, but in understanding. She wasn't caught off guard. She wasn't rattled. She was ready. And then she responded. You're right, Leavitt said calmly, her voice even and deliberate. Your generation did fight for women to have a voice, and I respect that. But there's one thing you got wrong. I am not here because of wokeness. I am here because I worked hard. I am here because I proved myself, and I do not believe that anyone, man or woman, should have their success dismissed as merely a product of an ideological movement. The audience, normally quick to applaud Whoopi's remarks, hesitated. A murmur moved through the crowd. Some exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. Goldberg's smirk faltered just slightly, but she wasn't about to let the conversation slip from her control. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, and let out a small, incredulous laugh. You really believe you didn't benefit from these policies? If it weren't for the progress the so-called woke movement made, do you think a young conservative woman like you would even be in this position? It was a trap. If Leavitt outright denied it, she risked appearing naive, ignoring the undeniable history of women's struggles for equality. If she agreed, she would undermine her entire argument. The panelists exchanged confident looks, certain that Goldberg had backed her into a rhetorical corner. But once again, Leavitt did not react the way they expected. She didn't rush to defend herself. She didn't scramble for words. She didn't let emotion dictate her response. Instead, she let the question hang in the air for a moment, allowing the audience to think about it before she answered. Then in a steady, unwavering voice, she delivered the response that would send shockwaves through the studio. I understand that past generations fought for equality, and I am grateful for that, she said. But here's the difference. Fighting for equality does not mean creating a system where people are judged by their gender or race rather than their ability. I believe in equal opportunity, not in privilege disguised as justice. The studio fell silent. The audience, the panelists, even Whoopi herself seemed momentarily caught off guard. This wasn't the defensive, flustered response they had anticipated. This wasn't the weak concession they had hoped for. This was something else entirely. For the first time in years, Whoopi Goldberg had no immediate comeback. She blinked, opened her mouth, closed it again. Something in the energy of the room had shifted. For the first time, Goldberg wasn't entirely in control of the debate. But this was just the beginning. Whoopi Goldberg was not the kind of woman to accept defeat easily, and in her mind, a new strategy was already forming. If she couldn't take Leavitt down with reasoning, she would resort to something else: sarcasm, personal attacks, and playing to the emotions of the audience. The real battle was about to begin. The tension in the studio was now impossible to ignore. The usual rhythm of The View, where progressive hosts dominated the conversation and conservative guests struggled to get a word in, had been completely upended. Karoline Leavitt wasn't backing down. She wasn't allowing herself to be drowned out or painted into a corner. Instead, she was holding her ground in a way that few guests had ever managed. Whoopi Goldberg, ever the dominant presence on the show, wasn't used to losing control. For years, she had shaped the narrative, dictated the tempo, and silenced opposing voices with sheer force of personality. But now, for the first time in recent memory, the audience wasn't reacting in their usual way. The standard round of applause and affirming laughter at her remarks had been replaced with hesitant silence, as if they were uncertain of how to process what was happening. Goldberg leaned forward in her chair, placing her hands on the table as she tried to regain her footing. "Let me get this straight," she said, her voice laced with skepticism. "You're telling me that you don't think you've benefited at all from the changes that people like me fought for? That without the progress made in this country, you'd still be sitting here as White House press secretary?" Leavitt, unfazed, nodded. "I believe in progress, Whoopi," she replied, her voice firm but measured. "But progress is about creating a world where everyone has the same opportunities, not one where people are placed into positions because of identity politics. My success isn't about my gender or my age. It's about my ability. That's the difference between merit and quotas." The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The audience, which had initially been primed to cheer for Whoopi's argument, found itself unsure. Some clapped hesitantly, while others remained quiet, watching the exchange with intrigue. It wasn't the reaction Goldberg had hoped for. Sensing that she was losing the edge, she shifted tactics. When logical arguments failed, she often relied on ridicule, on making the conservative guest appear foolish or out of touch. With a small chuckle, she leaned back in her chair, shaking her head as if amused. "Okay, let's talk about merit," she said, using air quotes to emphasize her sarcasm. "You think everyone gets where they are based purely on talent and hard work? That sounds nice, but let's be real. If that were true, we wouldn't still see so many disparities in this country. You're ignoring history, and quite frankly, you sound incredibly naive." Leavitt's expression didn't change. She didn't flinch at the insult, didn't let her composure slip even slightly. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if considering her response carefully before delivering it. "Whoopi, are you saying that I didn't work for what I have?" she asked. Goldberg hesitated. It was a trap, one that she had walked right into. If she outright said yes, she would be accusing a young, intelligent woman of having been handed success simply because of her gender. If she said no, she would have to concede that talent and hard work do, in fact, play a role in success. The pause was telling. Goldberg quickly tried to recover. "I'm saying that without the policies you criticize, you wouldn't even have had the chance to work for it," she said. Leavitt gave a small nod, as if she had been expecting that answer. "And yet, those same policies are now being used to tell people that their success isn't real," she countered. "That people aren't achieving things because they earn them, but because of some quota. That's the problem with identity politics. It takes away individual effort and reduces people to checkboxes." The words landed hard. Joy Behar, who had been relatively quiet during the exchange, jumped in, clearly hoping to change the direction of the conversation before it tilted too far in Leavitt's favor. "But isn't that easy for you to say?" she asked, gesturing toward the press secretary. "You come from privilege. You had opportunities that most people don't. It's easy to talk about merit when you already had a head start." Leavitt turned her attention to Behar, her expression unreadable. She knew exactly what they were trying to do: pivot the argument away from facts and into personal attacks. But she wasn't going to let that happen. "I wasn't handed anything," she said. "I grew up in a middle-class home. My parents worked hard to provide for our family. I put myself through college. I interned. I worked my way up. I didn't get where I am because of some special treatment. I got here because I earned it," Behar scoffed. "Oh, come on. You really expect us to believe you haven't benefited from anything beyond your own hard work?" Leavitt's gaze didn't waver. "I expect you to believe that people are capable of achieving success without being told they are victims?" The audience murmured again. There was a shift happening, subtle but undeniable. The hosts of The View were used to controlling the narrative, to guiding the audience's reaction. But today, the usual formula wasn't working. Goldberg, clearly growing frustrated, decided it was time to go on the offensive. "You know what really bothers me?" she said, her voice rising slightly. "People like you, young conservatives who act like they know everything, who sit there and dismiss the struggles that real people face every day." Leavitt leaned forward slightly. "I don't dismiss struggles," she said calmly. "I just don't believe in telling people that they can't overcome them. You talk about barriers, but I talk about breaking them." Goldberg's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't used to being challenged like this. Most conservative guests wilted under the pressure, either becoming defensive or flustered. But Leavitt wasn't playing that game. She wasn't reacting emotionally. She wasn't allowing them to frame her narrative. Behar, sensing Whoopi's growing frustration, attempted to steer the conversation elsewhere. "Let's talk about something else," she said. "You work for an administration that many people believe is out of touch with the average American. How do you respond to that?" Leavitt didn't miss a beat. "I think the real question is why so many Americans feel ignored by the media," she said. "Shows like this spend so much time pushing a certain narrative that they forget there are millions of people who don't agree with them. Maybe that's why more and more people are tuning out." It was a bold statement, and it landed. For the first time, the View host seemed genuinely unsettled. This wasn't just another conservative guest who could be steamrolled with clever edits and pre-planned comebacks. This was someone who had come prepared, someone who refused to be intimidated, someone who wasn't going to let them define her. Whoopi took a deep breath, her fingers tapping against the table. She wasn't done yet. She still had one final card to play, one final way to regain control. If logic wouldn't work, if ridicule wasn't enough, there was always emotion. And so with a dramatic sigh, she prepared to take the conversation in a different direction, one designed not to debate ideas but to paint Leavitt as the villain. But Leavitt saw it coming, and she was ready. Why? The atmosphere in the studio had shifted. What had started as a predictable back and forth between The View's liberal hosts and their conservative guest had transformed into something far more intense. Whoopi Goldberg, visibly frustrated, had been unable to corner Karoline Leavitt in the way she had intended. The press secretary was proving to be a rare kind of guest, one who refused to be drowned out, one who didn't shrink under pressure. For years, Goldberg had thrived in the View's controlled environment, where conservative guests often found themselves outnumbered, interrupted, and strategically maneuvered into weak positions. But Leavitt wasn't playing by their rules. She was calm, articulate, and, most notably, unshaken. Every attempt to paint her as ignorant, hypocritical, or out of touch had been met with composed, factual rebuttals. Goldberg, however, wasn't ready to give up control just yet. "Oh," she leaned forward again, her frustration now laced with condescension. "Let's talk about reality," she said, her voice sharper than before. "You sit here and talk about hard work and merit like that's all it takes, but you're ignoring the actual struggles that people face every single day. What about the millions of people who don't have the same opportunities you did?" It was a familiar tactic, shift the discussion away from facts and into emotions, force the conservative guest into an unwinnable position where any response could be spun as heartless. Leavitt, however, had anticipated this. She exhaled slowly before responding, choosing her words carefully. Whoopi, I don't deny that people face challenges, she said evenly. What I reject is the idea that the only solution is government dependency or identity-based preferences. The greatest equalizer is not a handout, it's empowerment. And that starts with opportunity, not victimhood, Goldberg scoffed. Oh, come on, she said, waving a hand dismissively. That's easy for you to say. You work for an administration that doesn't care about struggling Americans. You push policies that help the wealthy and leave everyone else behind. Leavitt didn't miss a beat. What policies are you referring to? She asked directly. Goldberg blinked. Excuse me? What specific policies are you claiming hurt struggling Americans? Leavitt pressed. Because if you're talking about tax cuts that allow people to keep more of their earnings, or deregulation that helps small businesses grow, I'd love to hear how those policies will leave people behind. Goldberg opened her mouth to respond, but for the first time she seemed unsure of how to proceed. The audience, sensing her hesitation, remained silent. Normally they would have cheered in support of the host, but this was different. Leavitt continued, seizing the moment. The problem with the argument you're making is that it assumes people need to be saved, she said. That without the government or woke policies, individuals, especially women and minorities, can't succeed on their own. But I don't believe that. I believe in creating a system where people are given the tools to thrive, not told they can't make it without someone else pulling them up. Joy Behar interjected before Goldberg could recover. So what? You don't think discrimination exists? She asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. You don't think some people start life with disadvantages? Leavitt turned to Behar and nodded. Of course, some people face more challenges than others. No one is denying that, she said. What I reject is the idea that those challenges should define them. People aren't statistics. They aren't just numbers in a system. They are individuals with potential, and the worst thing we can do is tell them that their destiny is already decided for them based on circumstances they didn't choose. The response was airtight. Behar narrowed her eyes, clearly irritated. That's easy for you to say. You're young, you're successful, and you work in one of the most powerful positions in the country. What do you know about struggling? Leavitt paused for a brief second, as if considering her next words carefully. Then she leaned slightly forward, her gaze steady. Struggle isn't exclusive to one political ideology, she said. Hardship doesn't ask who you voted for. Everyone, regardless of background, faces challenges at some point in their lives. The difference is in how we respond to them. Goldberg, still visibly frustrated, let out a deep breath and shook her head. It's exhausting listening to people like you talk about things you don't understand, she muttered. The moment was telling. When logic and debate failed, Goldberg had reverted to outright dismissal. Leavitt, however, wasn't done. She clasped her hands together and tilted her head slightly. Whoopi, I think the real issue here isn't whether I understand hardship, she said. It's whether you can accept that people can have different solutions for it. The words struck hard. The tension in the room was almost palpable. For the first time, Whoopi Goldberg, arguably one of the most dominant voices on The View, looked genuinely uncertain. And Karoline Leavitt knew she had just won this round.